Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Let's talk humanoids. Today's episode is called From Beyond Earth, 10 Humanoid Encounters. Today I've got cases from all over the world, reaching back in time all the way actually to 1950 up to 2015, so some pretty recent cases. And cases from Europe, of course, Sweden, Portugal, Italy, France, Yugoslavia actually, as well as Chile and Colombia in South America, and 3 cases from the United States. These are cases that involve a wide variety of humanoids, who it's my assessment are probably from beyond Earth, but you can certainly make up your own mind about that. These are cases that involve landings, face-to-face encounters with humanoids, some really interesting interactions as well, and of course all kinds of evidence. And by that I mean landing traces, electromagnetic disturbances, physiological effects, animal reactions, and get this, there's one case which involves a photograph of an alleged ET. So this should be pretty interesting. I've said it before, but it bears repeating. Each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. Each case provides its own unique insight into the UFO phenomenon. In the first case I'd like to talk about today, I found this one to be really poignant and quite interesting and unique. I call this one E.T. Contacts a Deaf-Mute Man. This is a really compelling case which took place, actually it's 3 encounters, the first occurring in 1950, the second in 1969, and the third in 1975. These all occurred in Floridablanca in Colombia. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. The case comes from researcher Virgilio Sanchez Osejo. And it was also confirmed by J. Allen Hynek, who personally interviewed the witness. Now, the witness is an artist by the name of William Ortiz, and he was born in Bucaramanga in Colombia in 1937, though lived in Floridablanca, which is really just south of Bucaramanga. And it was at age 5 that he lost his hearing. How this happened is not described. But in 1950, at age 13, he had his first of 3 experiences with extraterrestrials. It was just a little past 7 p.m., and William was riding his horse on the gravel road on his parents' property when he saw what he first thought was a child standing behind the bushes alongside this road. But as he continued to ride, an opening appeared in the bushes, and he saw this large disc-shaped object and several other small childlike figures moving around it. This object was hovering over a large rock. This is significant. But he now saw that these figures were not children at all. And looking at the closest figure, he saw that it was wearing a tight-fitting uniform with a turtleneck collar that covered everything except for the head and hands. The head was large in proportion to the body and hairless. The eyes were large, oval-shaped, and dark. You can see the drawing by the witness here. So these look like typical grays. He saw no ears, just a hole on the side of the head, a very small nose, and thin lips. He said they appeared to have 4 fingers on their hands, though he's not sure of this. He said their skin was kind of grayish-brown. Now this closest entity was only 6 or 7 feet away. The others in the craft were about 100 feet away. And some of the other figures, the ones by the craft, William noticed, had smaller eyes than the one that was right next to him. So he started focusing on this little gray standing in front of him, and he could see that it was male. That was his impression. He said it was staring directly at him and actually began to send him telepathic messages, while at the same time used hand signals. Now again, William is unable to hear. He's deaf. And he said that there were 8 words that this gray transmitted to him. And they came so fast that he's not sure if he got the correct sequence. But the words, as he recalls, are in, world, stop. Secret, sky, see, learn, love. So that's interesting. William's not quite sure what this message meant, but after it was delivered, the entity turned, moved behind a rock outcropping, disappearing from view for just a moment, and then began to float and sort of walk very quickly towards the craft. By this point, the other entities had already moved inside the craft. This last one entered, and instantly the craft moved straight up and moved off to the southwest and disappeared over the horizon. Now, William, again, was riding his horse. He's not sure if his horse reacted in any way, as he was so astonished by the encounter and all the implications it carried. But what's really interesting about this case is that this craft was hovering over a very famous rock formation called the Great Rock by locals. It measures about 30 feet in diameter and 12 feet high, pictured here. At any rate, William says the UFO was about the same size as this rock, and this rock is carved with various markings, including lions, disc shapes, serpents, and other figures and symbols, which are believed to have been carved by the indigenous people in this area some 1,000 years earlier. The really interesting thing about this first encounter is that William, he was deaf again. His hearing was temporarily restored. Unfortunately, his deafness returned, but he did have a second encounter in 1969 at age 32, which again resulted in his hearing being temporarily restored. Unfortunately, this encounter is not described, and also his deafness came back. Now, his final encounter, also not described, was in 1975, and there was no apparent healing in this case. But the most interesting aspect of this case to me is that William says the ETs communicated with him not only telepathically, but using various hand signals. By the way, William is educated. He's able to read and write in Spanish. I think there's a lot to learn from that case. I find it really interesting, not only the witness, but where this contact took place, right over this stone with all these ancient carvings on it. The communication that this man had with the ETs who used hand signals. That's amazing. It's just a really interesting case all around. And now let's move to the next one. This next case got quite a bit of attention. It's actually a series of events. I call this one The Little Man of Norbotten. And this took place in the 1970s, more specifically 1970 through 1972, primarily in Norbotten, Sweden, and surrounding areas. It's quite an amazing series of events, which I find super interesting because these witnesses, who did not know each other and were in different areas, all described very much the same type of encounter. So there's something clearly going on in these cases. This case is so interesting because many people saw this strange little man in the area of Norbotten, Sweden. In fact, most of the sightings occurred in a sharply defined area on roads 98 and 397, which borders the Kalix River. One of the first occurred on August 19, 1970, when Mr. Olaf Molander, his wife Marta, and their friend Assur Sandberg were driving between Narken and Luleå on a dark rainy night when they saw this 3-foot-tall man wearing what looked like a helmet and a gray coat standing alongside the road. Now as they approached, again this is at night, they're driving, the little figure put its hands up to its face as if to shield his eyes from the glare of the headlights. Now moments later, the interior of their vehicle and the road around them became illuminated with a blindingly bright light. At the same time, there was a loud banging noise. Now afterwards, this little man was still there, but the witnesses were too afraid to stop, and they drove on. What's really interesting is later, Ossar Sandberg reported some pretty serious vision problems in one of his eyes. This is just one of the series of events that occurred around this time, because it was just a few months later, on February 2nd, 1971, that Martha Manlinden and her friend were driving near Kaminki. This is actually in Finland. It was around 8 p.m. when they noticed a bright light pacing their vehicle. It went from one side and then to the other, paced their car down the highway for some time, then darted away, and moments later, they saw what they thought was a little child crossing the road right in front of their car. In fact, Martha thought she was going to hit this poor kid, but they quickly saw that it was not a child, but was a little man wearing these strange green and brown clothes and what looked like a helmet. They were quite frightened and did not stop and drove off. Now, that same exact evening, two residents in the town of Caljari looked out the window of their home and saw this short little figure standing in the road, maybe 3 feet tall. Described in the same way, he was wearing dark clothes and what looked like a helmet, and they didn't think too much of it. After a few moments, he disappeared, and the only reason they reported it and realized it was unusual was because they started to hear about the other reports coming in. Now, here's another witness. This is one of the more interesting events of this series of encounters. And the main witness in this case is Ake Westerberg. He's 20 years old. And it was February 16, 1971. It was around 6 p.m. And Ake was waiting for the bus when he saw a figure standing just a short distance away. And he thought, this is strange because this figure is very short, does not look normal. He had a strange hat on his head and looked like kind of a raincoat kind of covering. And as Ake says, at first I thought it was a comrade in the village, so I called out a few names but got no answer. Then I started walking closer to see who was standing there. I got about 20 meters away before he turned on the light. Now, Ake could see enough to see that this beam of light was coming from a small box strapped to the man's chest. And this beam of light struck Ake full on, dazzling his vision and causing him to turn and flee. Now, opening his eyes, he looked back and could see that the entire road was now bathed in light. It was bright enough to cast his own shadow on the road behind him. But as Ake says, it turned a while before I regained my sight. It was dead quiet, and I was scared as hell where I stood. So there's that dead quiet sound that we often hear in these cases, the Oz effect, I guess you might call it. At any rate, the light faded, and when Ake searched the area, this little man was no longer there. But that night, Ake suffered some strange physical symptoms. As he says, I woke up in the middle of the night completely paralyzed. My body ached in a way I had never experienced before or since. Now, thankfully, by morning he was fine, but he definitely attaches that to his experience. Now, another sighting occurred not long after this, February 25. Mrs. Anne-Marie Lumbick saw a 3-foot tall little man, and she was driving again, and she described the same exact details. A helmet, dark clothes, and a bright flash of light. As she says, I didn't feel scared, but I'm absolutely sure I saw the little man. So this was starting to get quite a bit of publicity by this time. Another report, which is not dated, but apparently part of the same cluster of events, comes from a gentleman by the name of R. Strahlberg, who writes, quote, one of my friends and her parents met him when driving their car outside the village. It was in a small road in the woods at late evening. He stood in the road, so they had to stop. He had black clothes which were a bit shiny, like a raincoat. He held a tiny box in front of him, and after a short moment, he made some movement with his hand on the box, which turned on a light so strong they had to look away. Suddenly the light was gone, and so was the little man. How interesting is that? Here we see that pattern that turns up so many times with ETs showing up alongside a remote highway at night. But it's also interesting because these cases seem to follow a pretty set pattern, with a bright light, a loud noise, and then the sighting of this short little humanoid figure. Don't know what's going on here, but yeah, these cases did get quite a bit of publicity and attention, and I think it's certainly an important addition to our understanding of extraterrestrial contact. And now we move to the next case. I wanted to include this one because it provides an important example of the fact that ETs can be seen just about anywhere. I call this case Aliens at a Radio Station. This occurred in the spring of 1975 in Maribor, Yugoslavia. Of course, Yugoslavia no longer exists. It's now going by a different name. But this is a really interesting case involving a single witness, yes, but some really interesting electromagnetic effects of a kind that I haven't quite heard before. And yeah, the location of the encounter is also really interesting, and the interaction that the witness had with these really unusual humanoids is just plain fascinating. The location of this incident is now known as Slovenia, but at the time it was in Maribor, Yugoslavia. In fact, it took place in downtown Maribor at the Radio Maribor studio. The eyewitness is Mr. Barkard, and he was a night watchman. A lot of night watchmen have encounters. And this encounter began in a very strange way with some unusual phone calls. And I'll just quote the witness directly. I was on night duty, and it was somewhere between 10 and 10:30 p.m. The office phone started ringing, and I picked it up, but no one answered. I hung up, and at the same moment the phones rang in the studio. They are line phones. One is connected to Teznan on the outskirts of Maribor, and the others to the post office. The phones rang at the same time, and I picked up one of the receivers, but no one answered. From all the phones, only a kind of vibrating sound was heard. It can be compared to the sound of a radio that is tuned between two stations. I tried to call the post office, but no one answered. I then went back to the room I used during the service and called the post office from there to ask why they kept calling, and then hang up. They replied that they had not called me at all this evening. I got the same answer from those I called on the second one. I then called our technician at home, who said that it could possibly come from the weather. I took a look outside and could see that the weather was clear and fine. So this was a weird series of events. It had never happened before, but the witness didn't think much of it until about a month or two later, when something really weird happened. The witness was at work doing the night shift again. He had sat down to watch some TV when weird streaks and snow began to interfere with the television screen. This again had not happened before. Finally, he just turned off the TV and began doing his rounds, and then he walked into the strangest experience of his life. And again, I'll just quote the witness directly because he describes it in great detail. As he says, I went back to work. At the same moment, I heard steps out in the hall and studio where there were no people at this time. I hastened and got up in the chair, and at the same moment the office door opened. It was shining outside in the corridor. I took a breath, for in came 4 men, and they did not walk like humans. One could best describe their way of walking as leaning, elastic, springy. 2 of them stood next to me, the 3rd in front, and the 4th stood in the doorway. As for their appearance, I noted that they had some sort of hat or helmet on their head. Their faces were markedly elongated, had serious looks, and the eyes seemed motionless all the time. Their eyes were larger, and likewise the mouth, rather large lips, and an elongated head. The clothing was close-fitting and overall-like. The man standing in the doorway almost reached the door frame with his head, so he was approximately 2 meters high. I became very afraid because their looks didn't look quite normal. The two who were standing next to me looked at each other at the same time. The one who was standing in front of me raised his right arm and pressed his thumb into the back of my neck. I can still evoke the feeling of how it felt as he pressed his thumb against my neck. At this moment, it was something vibrating around me, some kind of unknown energy. Then, without further ado, they went back the same way without completely closing the door. I quickly ran out of the room, but there was not the slightest trace, and no sound was heard from them. I went through all the rooms and checked all the windows, but everything was fine. Now, this door had been closed before, so it was left open. This gave him confirmation that this did physically happen. But these beings were quite unusual looking. In fact, they reminded the witness of the famous French comedic actor by the name of Fernandel. You can see him here. They had very broad shoulders, filling almost the entire doorway. He said their clothes were quite dark. So quite an unusual encounter, and that was pretty much it. But there was an interesting final end note, because the witness says that after all of this, he did see a glowing disc-shaped object hovering near his house. A few days before this incident, he did receive another series of strange phone calls. But each time he picked up the phone, nobody answered. And once when he even picked up the receiver, the phone would still ring. And there was one final bizarre detail. During this time, his phone bills increased for no apparent reason. So there you go. What a strange series of events with all these unusual phone calls. His phone bill going way up for some unexplained reason, but apparently attached to all this. And I have to tell you, I don't know how I would react if ETs suddenly showed up at my office where I worked, walked up to me and pressed their thumb against the back of my neck. Very strange. Quite an unusual series of events, but again, fits the pattern we do see in a lot of cases, how he describes the ETs. He saw a UFO in connection with all this. It's a really interesting case. And now we move to the next one, which also involves more than one event, and this is the one that actually involves a photograph of an apparent ET. I call this one Alien or Escaped Circus Dwarf, and you'll see why I gave it that title in just a second. This occurred in May and September of 1976 in Monte Parodi. This is in La Spezia, Italy. And it's a really interesting series of events because there are multiple witnesses. There are landing traces. There's an apparent photograph. In fact, in one of the cases, the witnesses themselves were UFO researchers. It's a very well-confirmed case. Now, this case involves two separate humanoid sightings, which may or may not be related. I think they are. They occurred in the same place. This case was investigated by Italian researcher Stelio Asso. The first incident occurred on May 14, 1976. It was 4:30 in the afternoon as the witnesses, two men known only by their initials, BC and NA, they were hiking through the abandoned military barracks at Monte Parodi, again in La Spezia, Italy, when they saw a strange figure. He not only looked strange, he was dressed strangely and was moving strangely. This figure was first observed on the doorstep of one of the semi-underground rooms, and it was running quickly, but with a very strange, awkward gait. As the witnesses said, quote, like if while walking he slipped slightly raised on the ground. In other words, he seemed to sort of glide or float. He was quite short, about 3.5, maybe 4 feet tall, very thin, very frail looking, and he was wearing a skin-tight black jumpsuit which covered his entire body and head from hands to feet. The only part that wasn't covered was where his eyes would be, and this is where the witnesses saw two slanted slits which seemed to glow. Their figure was observed for about 15 or 20 seconds, at which point it disappeared into thin air. This was in an area where there was no vegetation or any place to hide, so it disappeared right in front of them. And that was the first case. And it was some months later, on September 7, 1976, that researcher Stelio Asso went to this location with his daughter and son. His daughter's Maria Grazia. He also brought along a photographer by the name of Roberto Molino and a group of about a dozen other UFO researchers. They were all from the Italian UFO group, GORU, the Group of Observational Research Ufological. And it was around 8:50 p.m. They had really just arrived at the scene, and this is when they noticed a really unnatural silence. This is that weird Oz effect again. As Stelio says, the air was perfectly still and oppressive, the silence unnatural, no noise. It completely lacked those nocturnal sounds characteristic of all country towns. Even the background noise of this city didn't reach us. Everything was as if static, extraordinarily still. So he said no birds chirping, no bugs, nothing. Now the photographer, Roberto, was snapping photographs. And as he was doing this, using a flash camera which illuminated the area, because it was dark, this is when they noticed a short humanoid figure dressed in black from head to toe, moving very quickly, but just a short distance away. And as Stelio says, the entity moved quickly, but silently, as if skiing. It flew over the ground, heading towards the tall bushes that border the clearing on the sea side. So the photographer was snapping photos, lighting up the area with these flashes, while Stelio and the others rushed towards the area where they had seen this figure. Now they couldn't see him, they couldn't find anything. And after some time of searching around, they decided they were going to just pack up and go home. And this is when another identical looking figure, or perhaps the same one, appeared. And when they saw it, everyone rushed towards the figure. As Stelio says, the individual was moving quickly towards the bush area. We gained ground, and when we came within a few steps of him, we had him here. It was reached when he disappeared before he had even reached the hedges. What left us particularly astonished was the manner in which it disappeared. It quickly disappeared from our sight, as if it were gradually becoming invisible from the bottom up. Now, even when it was no longer visible, they could hear it moving through the brush. They could hear footsteps, they could hear branches, they could also hear a breathing sound. Now, during all of this time, there was some pretty intense fear, panic, and confusion among the group. Two of the witnesses actually fainted dead away. One had a severe emotional breakdown. One of them, a geology student, had brought a Geiger counter, and he said it, quote, ticked like mad. Now, not longer after this being disappeared, at around 10:20 p.m., the entire group did see a glowing object move overhead. Later, returning to the site, they did find a group of roundish footprints or landing traces of some kind, but more amazing was when they looked at the photos, they found one which showed the figure that they had all seen. You can see it here, and while this photo is somewhat blurry, with so many witnesses, it appears to be entirely genuine. Stelio and the others did make a report to the police, who took the report very seriously. They verified the photograph. They conducted an investigation. So this got quite a bit of attention, and it was around this time that rumors began to spread that the group had seen nothing more than an escaped dwarf from a traveling circus that had been in the La Spezia area some days earlier. This is a claim, by the way, which the group vehemently denies. They said what they saw was not an escaped circus dwarf. The police did investigate this rumor, but were not able to confirm it in any way, so this just appears to be a simple debunking effort. At any rate, this did cause quite a bit of attention. Stelio and the others later returned to the same spot in August 8 of 1977, and UFOs showed up. They had, in fact, an interactive encounter with this UFO. As Stelio says, in part, at 10:56, we saw in the sky a luminous source. Exactly 1 minute later, we saw another luminous emission in the same spot. So we chose to answer it if signals came as an answer from the sky. 2 more signals and 2 more answers. In all, we signaled 5 more times, which were regularly answered by the vehicle. So how amazing is that? I think that case, especially the second one, would qualify as a CE5, a close encounter of the fifth kind, or a human-initiated contact, given that they went out there to investigate UFOs and what should show up but an ET. And no, I don't think it was an escaped circus dwarf. I found that actually kind of amusing. People will often go to ridiculous lengths to explain away an encounter, and I think that's probably what's going on here, because the way the witnesses described this figure, it does not sound like an escaped circus dwarf to me, because an escaped circus dwarf, who was never confirmed by the way, simply cannot float around or disappear right in front of your eyes, and just the description given does not match a person as we would think of it, a normal human here on Earth. So yeah, a super interesting case with all kinds of interesting elements to it. Of course, the photograph and the landing traces and the fact that there were so many witnesses, I mean 15 in that second case, provides a level of credibility to it that makes it pretty much impossible to deny that something very unusual happened. And now let's move to the next case. I wanted to include this one because we get such a wide variety of descriptions of humanoids. I have to tell you, this one is off the charts strange when it comes to descriptions. I call this one a purple-haired alien. Now, it's true the witness was quite frightened, so perhaps he wasn't observing as carefully as he may have otherwise, but you can make up your own minds about it. This case occurred on March 13, 1978 in Villar Formosa, Portugal, and it's quite an amazing encounter, as you'll see. This case was investigated by the Centro de Estudos Astronómicos e Fenómenos Insólitos, which is basically the study of astronomy and unknown phenomena. This group was founded by Joaquim Fernandez, who you can see here, and this is somewhat a brief case, but so unusual it deserves to be more well known. It was the morning of March 13, 1978, as a 10-year-old student by the name of Claudio Franco was at his primary school, located at the end of the small village of Villar Formosa. This is just south of Almeida in Portugal. Claudio had to relieve himself, so he left class and went to the bathroom, which was located at the rear of the building. As he exited the bathroom, he says somebody or something pushed him on his back so hard that he was pushed right to the floor. And turning around, he got an incredible shock because he saw this strange figure standing there that clearly was not human. It did appear to be a male humanoid, very short in stature, but its face was really strange. It looked badly scarred or very wrinkled. It had curly purple hair and was wearing a skin-tight white coverall which flared out below the knees. It wore no shoes, it was barefoot, and strapped to its waist was a belt with this box-shaped device with what looked like buttons on it. So Claudia lay there absolutely stunned, stared at this figure in numb shock, for a few minutes at least, trying to regain his senses. And finally, realizing that this was absolutely unusual, he began screaming in absolute fear. And it was at this moment that the figure put one of its hands on the device that was strapped around its waist, and this figure suddenly became engulfed in a flash of colorful lights, and it promptly disappeared. Claudio was so overwhelmed by all this that he was actually unable to stand up. He had to crawl over to a nearby well, and he was still screaming for help. Finally, a teacher heard him and arrived. Claudio said that the entire incident lasted about 10 minutes. That's a long time. And there were some after effects from all this. Following the incident, Claudio suffered from back pain, and they found strange burn-like marks which appeared on his back, and these were accompanied by a burning sensation, but they only lasted for a few days. How about that for high strangeness? A really unusual humanoid. Of course, there are physiological effects which are hard to explain away or, fake. So this witness did have some physical effects from his experiences and was certainly emotionally affected as well. I find it really interesting because this case did take place at a school. And as you may know, I've done a series of episodes on schoolyard encounters and also wrote an entire book which covers more than 100 cases which took place at schools. So there might be a connection there as well. It's certainly a fascinating case. And now we move to another case which I had to include because it is so unusual. I call this one, "We Love You." Of course, this is a quote directly from the ETs. This case occurred on October 14, 1978 in Bear Valley, Colorado. This is a suburb of Denver. And this is a fascinating case which does involve multiple witnesses and some really interesting, I guess you would call it psychic effects and emotional effects as well. It's just a really unusual case, as we'll see. October 14, 1978 turned out to be a very interesting day for Peggy Otis. It started out great. She remarked on it. She was having a great day. Earlier, she had taken 5 friends to visit a psychic who lived nearby her home in Denver, Colorado. And after that, she was outside her home. She actually told this little boy who lived down the street, quote, "I feel so good today. Something is going to happen to me." She was just kidding, or so she thought, but it turned out she wasn't. Those words turned out to be very prophetic, because it was later that night she would have one of the most shocking experiences of her life. That night, she went to visit a friend in Bear Valley. This is a suburb of Denver, and she brought along her young granddaughter Jenny with her. And they had the visit, and as they drove home, Jenny became sleepy. She lay down her head on Peggy's lap, and Peggy was about 8 blocks from her home and was driving south down South Windermere Street and approaching Cayley Avenue, as you can see here, when something very unusual happened. And I'll just let Peggy describe it in her own words. As she says, "I saw this thing, like an airplane, but it had sparks coming out from under it. I thought, that's an airplane that is going to land on me. So I turned the corner and went about 300 feet. Just as I did, I saw this dome, and so I stopped and got out of my car. I stood in the middle of the street, screaming my lungs out. I wanted Jennifer, her granddaughter, to wake up and look out the window. Just as she got up and looked out the windshield, I saw this. It was massive. It went over the top of me. It looked like the deck of a ship. I was really petrified. I crawled back into the car, and just as I started to get into the car, I looked up at the moon, and I saw 2 angels floating in the moon. And then they disappeared. I got into the car, and I sat down and looked at Jenny. I thought I was losing my mind. I really thought I was having a nervous breakdown or freaking out. There is a church close by, and I looked over at some people by the church, and they didn't even see it. I don't think they even looked up and saw it." So yeah, she saw these weird angels. This might be a screen memory, as we'll see, but the encounter wasn't over yet, because Peggy looked ahead of her and saw the object again. It was still emitting what looked like sparks, but it was now hovering a few blocks ahead, right over South Broadway, as you can see here. She raced up the street, and just as she got there, the object vanished right in front of her eyes. Again, Peggy could hardly believe it. As she says, "I really doubted my sanity all the time. I thought I was cracking up." So she turned around. She had passed her street. She went to her home on Longview Street and told her husband what happened. Thankfully, he was very supportive, and they ended up staying up half the night, listening to the radio and watching TV, hoping to see if anyone reported anything. Nobody did. She did call the local airport and asked if they had seen any UFOs. They thought she was crazy. They said no, they hadn't. Now, the next morning, Peggy was using the garbage disposal, which makes a humming noise, and her little granddaughter Jenny said, "That's the way it sounded." And as Peggy says, and it was. That was exactly the way it sounded. It sounded like a hum. So she and her granddaughter Jenny both remembered this object making a humming sound. Jenny did recall seeing the object too, and she told Peggy that there had been a red car ahead of them with a family inside. She saw them stop, look up at the craft, get all scared, and then race away. Now, Peggy didn't see the car. She was paying too close attention to the object, but she does remember hearing it screech away at high speed. Now, this is interesting because at the time of her encounter, Peggy was taking a local parapsychology class. She decided she would share her sighting with her fellow students, who encouraged her to tell the teacher. She agreed. She told him what happened. He kind of gave her a strange look. She asked, "Do you believe me?" And he said, "Yes, I do." And he shared that his own niece had a similar experience. Now, despite having another witness and other people talking about this, Peggy still felt some doubt. As she says, "When it happened, it took me a long time to really, I just couldn't believe I had seen it. I thought that I had gone crazy. I thought, this is it. I am cracking up." So it affected her quite profoundly. In fact, her health began to suffer. As Peggy says, "I had real bad health that winter. I was a bundle of nerves ever since it happened. I was in the hospital 3 or 4 times. They put me on a heart monitor, and my heart would just go crazy. They said nothing was wrong with me. They ran every type of test they could on me." So nothing was wrong with her. It was apparently just this very strong emotional reaction. She couldn't get it out of her head. And 2 years later, she decided to go under hypnosis. She contacted Dr. Leo Sprinkle, PhD, and under hypnosis did recall some other details. She recalled that she had actually received communication from little gray beings. Now, she didn't have any noticeable missing time. She didn't recall being taken on board or anything like this, but she did recall having telepathic impressions from this little man with a whitish gray head and slanted eyes. In fact, there were several of them aboard the craft, she says, and one in particular was speaking to her. And as Peggy says, "They gave me 3 messages. They said, 'We love you. We'll be back. Don't forget us.'" And in fact, they also had a few other things to say. As Peggy says, "They told me to go into the psychic, to study the psychic world. So I did. I was taking parapsychology then, so I have been giving readings. And I have a group every week that comes to the house. We have a lot of strange things happen, but I'm still not well. One of the things they told me was this: leave Littleton, Colorado, because the pollution is so bad." So they gave her some advice. And as she says, "So that's our next move. We are going to move out of Littleton, and I think I'll feel better." Peggy also said that after this encounter, she began to have impressions of past lives, which she connects directly to her experience. How amazing is that case? And yet, it fits the pattern we see in many other cases. I do think it is probably one of the ET goals to wake us up to our psychic abilities. So to have the ETs tell Peggy flat out that you should pursue psychic development definitely fits the pattern here. It's also interesting to me that they told her that she needs to move out of the city. It's too polluted where she lives. This is something that turns up in a number of cases. There's just some really interesting elements to that whole case, which, by the way, we very nearly didn't hear about, because Peggy did present her experiences at the Rocky Mountain UFO conference, but almost backed out. At the last minute, she decided it was important to share her experience, and I'm glad she did, because again, each case adds to our knowledge of what's going on here, and her case certainly, I think, has some important insights and takeaways. And now let's move to the next case. I call this one My world would never again be the same. And this is, of course, is something a lot of witnesses express. An encounter can change everything. And boy, was this a very close-up encounter and so unusual. This one took place one evening in August 1979 in Surrey, Maine. It is a multiple witness case. It's got actually more than one event. But it's rare to see a UFO this close up and a humanoid. And what an unusual humanoid, and really the behavior as well is quite unusual. So I think you'll find it quite an interesting case. It was around 10 p.m. one evening, again in August of 1979, and Miss H.M. Dickinson had just invited a friend to her home. Her home overlooks Patton Bay, as you can see here, again in Surrey, Maine. Now her friend had just arrived, came out onto the porch where Miss Dickinson was sitting, and then he stopped in his tracks, looked up and shouted out, "What's that?" Miss Dickinson jumped to her feet. She looked out over the bay and was shocked to see a strange object, which wasn't far. In fact, it was only a few feet away from her house and from her. She said it was so close that, as she said, any closer it would have scraped the paint. This object was quite small. It was this very small transparent craft, dimly lit with yellow light, kind of like a candlelight. And as Miss Dickinson says, it was just big enough for one occupant and shaped like an antique Mazda Edison electric light bulb. I know, I have a couple. Believe me, after that few seconds, I knew my world would never again be the same. There was a whole universe full of new activity in which I had become involved. Now, I had seen a number of lovely spacecraft, but as long as they were way up in the sky, they did not concern me. This, however, was another matter. So she saw this thing very close, and the most shocking part of it was this weird occupant which sat on a box-like chair and was holding a pole, or what looked like, she interpreted, as some sort of steering device, and it was looking directly at her. She had some difficulty describing this being. In some ways it looks like the typical gray, but she said its head had a, quote, layered bandage look. Kind of reminded her of a wasp's nest in a weird way. She said it also looked a bit like the India Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And as Miss Dickinson says, he reminded me of Nehru, with his tight breeches and the slightly cut shoulder of his tunic. She said this figure was very thin. She says, ever so slight, skinny. She said he was so skinny that he could have, quote, been made of pipe cleaners. Now, this craft was right next to the porch, right next to the house, and she said that it had to do some, quote, fancy steering just to miss the elm tree which overhung the porch. This craft made no noise whatsoever, but it was so close that she got a really good close-up look at it and the figure inside. She said this figure was sitting, slightly turned, not quite in profile, but did turn his head almost mechanically to observe her, and she estimated that it was no more than 3 or 4 feet tall. And again, I'll just let her describe in her own words. As she says, he turned like a porcelain doll, swivel-headed. Also, he sat straddling what appeared to be a square formica box, either white or pale blue. His right hand was extended forward to a control panel, which was in true profile. I could make out no levers or meters. His head was shaped like Nefertiti. His eyes were aslant, up at the outer corners. I saw no nose or mouth. For this reason, I believe him to be unisex, although I did not visually explore the possibility of a drop seat. He was right-handed, that hand being extended forth to the control panel. His left arm sort of hung at his side. His feet hardly touched the floor, similar to a child's too large chair. Now, Miss Dickinson speculates, or she had this impression that he did not eat and sort of sustained himself through osmosis. She's not sure why she feels this way. She really only viewed him for a moment when suddenly the entire craft and occupant disappeared. As Miss Dickinson says, he simply turned off like a switch. Had I known that, I would have run for a closet. He had a fine opportunity to look at humans at close range. We resembled fish with our eyes popping and our mouths hanging open. So lucky for her, she did have another witness, but she was still reluctant to talk about it. But several nights later, she saw it again, this time hovering by her neighbor's porch and back field, and he saw it too. So she was now so impressed by these two events that she decided to make a report to the Center of UFO Studies, CUFOS, who published it in the CUFOS Associates newsletter. Can you imagine just sitting out there on your back porch and having a UFO come flying by that close and having this humanoid turn and look at you? It's really unusual. And this is another case that we almost didn't hear about and probably wouldn't have if this UFO didn't come back for a second appearance and show off itself to the neighbor. So this just goes to show that these experiences are probably a lot more common than we hear about, because many people will report a sighting, but if it involves a humanoid, people are much less likely to talk about it for fear of ridicule and disbelief. Thankfully, that's changing. This is one of the reasons why I put out these episodes, so that people can know we're not alone. Many people are having these experiences. And now we move to another encounter. This is a pretty shocking one. This one wasn't fully investigated. It just comes from a gentleman who reported it to the newspaper, but it does have some really interesting confirmation to it. I call this one, I Never Believed in Aliens. This took place early one morning in February of 1981 in a rural area of Westfield, North Carolina. And I think you'll find this case absolutely compelling and certainly fascinating and really unique and unusual. The witness in this case is anonymous, and again he sent a letter to the Mount Airy, North Carolina News, writing, "You may think I'm crazy, stupid, or just telling you a fib, but what I'm about to tell you actually happened. I have never believed in aliens or monsters, but I don't know what it was that I saw." It was in early February 1981 as this man, who lives on a rural farm on the outskirts of Westfield, went to go milk his cows around dusk. His hunting hound dog joined him as he usually does, but then his dog started barking and sniffing and then took off as though chasing a rabbit or something. This was not unusual. The farmer finished milking his cow and then went to follow his dog up this hill next to a wooded area. It was now pretty much completely dark, but the farmer did have a flashlight, and as he came upon his dog, he saw that his dog was fighting with some kind of creature, and he was not at all prepared for what he saw. As the farmer says, "I was 30 feet, or maybe a little more, away from him. At first I thought he was fighting with another animal, but when I saw what he had almost chewed up, I was so scared that I almost froze. I don't know what this was. I don't know whether it was a person, animal, or what. It had no hair on its head or body. It was only about 5 feet tall. It had pink skin, a very large head, and small frog-like hands and feet. It had 2 large eyes and no nose or mouth. The best I could tell, it was wearing a dress or robe. I looked at it for only a few seconds. It seemed to still be alive, but where my hound had chewed on him, I saw no blood at all. My dog had mangled both his legs and one of his arms. I think it was his right arm. After I examined it for a few seconds, I ran back to my home as fast as I could, locked my doors, got in my car, and headed for Mount Airy. I spent the night at a motel right behind the diner Burger. So yeah, this traumatized him so bad, he left his dog behind, he locked his house, and spent the night away from his house. Now he did return the next day, and sadly found that his dog had passed away. He also noticed that 2 of his cows were missing. Whatever it was that his dog had attacked was now gone. and he did not talk about what happened for 2 weeks, but finally contacted the newspaper because he wanted to know if anyone else had seen anything around this time. And as he wrote in his letter, "I haven't told anyone about this. You're the only ones I've told this story to. If I told anyone what I had seen that night, they would think I was joking or had a nut loose in my head. The reason I am telling this is that maybe someone else has seen what I've seen." Now, following the publication of the man's letter in the Mount Airy News, in fact, another witness did come forward. The gentleman by the name of Odell Harold said that he and several others saw a UFO just days after the farmer's encounter. He said the object hovered over the industrial park area, was silent at first, very low to the ground, much too low to be a conventional aircraft. It had 3 rows of lights, and as Odell Harold says, it looked like nothing I had ever seen at night. He said it moved off towards Hobson. It made a low-pitched roaring noise. Now, back in 1973, when there was a whole bunch of humanoid reports, there were in fact 3 separate humanoid reports in this general area. I do wish we had more follow-up on that case, but unfortunately it ends there, so it's hard to say what happened next. But certainly a compelling case for a number of reasons. I'm glad this farmer did decide to come forward, because he didn't have to. I really wonder what happened to the ET in this case. Such an unusual report. I don't think I've heard anything quite like it. But by all accounts, it does appear to be a genuine and legitimate case, and certainly not the only ET report in this area. In fact, I've covered a couple of them from the Mount Airy, North Carolina area in previous episodes. So this is a new one that fits right into this area. I'm not sure what's going on in this area to bring so many amazing humanoid reports, but there it is. And now we move to the next case. Also super fascinating. Also a multiple witness case, by the way. I call this one, "We Come From Very Far Away." This is a direct quote from the apparent ETs, and quite a compelling and really unusual series of events, with this lady seeing an ET in a very public place, just basically walking down the street. This case took place on February 6, 1991 in Chaville, France. This case was investigated by a leading French researcher, Joël Maynard, who's also the editor of the very respected publication Lumière dans la nuit, Lights in the Night. The main witness is known only as Sylvia. At the time of her encounter, she lived on Rue Alexis Mineral. This borders the Meudon forest in Chaville, France. You can see it here. It was on the night of February 6, 1991, that she and her 2 friends, Gilda and Michel, were walking along the edge of the Ursine Pond, which you can see here, and Gilda surprised the other 2 by asking them if they believed in UFOs. And she immediately pointed to this brilliant star-like object hovering in the western sky and said, "Do you see that star there? Well, that is not a star. It's a UFO." Now Sylvia wasn't sure what to think of this proclamation, and after a short while of watching this object, all 3 of them returned to their homes. But Sylvia said she felt this very strange and strong compulsion, which really surprised her, to go return to the pond and look for this object, which she did, and she quickly spotted it. She watched it for a few moments when it did something strange. It suddenly moved, darting at acute angles, forming a sort of triangular pattern. Then, for reasons she can't describe, she decided to go home and take the longer and more isolated forest path home. This is when suddenly a light appeared to her left. Now she turned towards it, thinking perhaps it was a street lamp, but it wasn't, because suddenly it struck her with a beam of light, which caused a very strange feeling, made her feel very light, almost as if she was being levitated. As Sylvia says, My body was seized with fizzing sensations, like a caress on the skin, and that each spot of my nervous system was being sucked up. This gave a feeling of lightness and attraction. I was scared, and I cried to myself, "Sylvia, go home. Something very serious will happen to you." So maybe there's more to this encounter here, but in any case, she became quite afraid, and she started running towards home. She noticed that as she did, this beam of light seemed to follow her briefly, but once she got home, she was able to calm down. She finally went to bed, but it was shortly later she woke up to an even stranger experience. When she woke up, she instantly noticed that her blankets and sheets were all piled up, and standing by the side of her bed was a 3 to 4 foot tall humanoid figure wearing a greenish jumpsuit. It looked back at her with an expression of surprise, as if it had not expected her to wake up. It then looked to the left, and Sylvia had some trouble understanding and believing what she saw next. As Sylvia says, "I saw appear, as on a screen, the interior of his spaceship. There, behind a long semicircular table, stood the whole general staff of the ship. It seemed there were only men there. They wore costumes identical to those of airline pilots, with dark suits and caps. They had an air of pride in themselves. Then the men fell backwards a step and disappeared, and so did the screen." So Sylvia was now alone in her room, and after calming down again, she went back to sleep. But no surprise, her experiences weren't over yet. The next morning she had to work, and as she left to go to work, she looked up at the sky and surprised herself by sending out a mental message saying, "Will you return one day from where you come? And what do you do on Earth?" This really surprised her. She wasn't expecting herself to do this, but she was even more surprised when she received an immediate telepathic response which said, "It is a tedious journey. We come from very far away. We can come only approximately every 30 years. We come to make studies on the green planet." So that was the message she got, and things still weren't over yet. She continued walking to work, and as she approached the bus stop, she noticed a very strange figure who both looked strange and was dressed strangely, and did not appear to be human. This figure wore a large cape, it had an oversized hairless head, dark gray wrinkly skin, and a very thin emaciated body. And in fact, it looked at her. This was still some distance away, but close enough that she got a good look at it. She said it scowled at her menacingly and then quickly dematerialized her. It frightened her really badly, to the point she said that if it had been any closer, she felt like it might have destroyed her body and soul. And that was it. But there was an interesting endnote to all this, because the next weekend she went to visit her extended family, who really surprised her by saying that they had just had a UFO encounter. Turned out a few days earlier, they were driving from Vélizy to Chaville and saw two low-flying objects which appeared to be triangular in shape. Now encouraged, Sylvia shared her own encounters, which quite shocked her relatives. After that, she did keep quiet. She just didn't talk about it. But many years later, thinking about what happened, she felt this wave of fear about it and decided to contact researchers. But she does admit that since this series of events, nothing else has happened to her. So how amazing is that, with 3 people seeing this UFO and the witness deciding, you know what, I'm going to go back and check this out. It's really interesting because we do see this in quite a few cases where people don't react quite the way they thought they would. For example, she took a different path home, the long way around through the forest. Why did she do that? And this ended up in having a major encounter. Not only was there this sighting, but she ended up having this face-to-face encounter with humanoids in her bedroom. This is another pattern we see. What might start out as a simple sighting suddenly escalates into deeper levels of contact and, of course, communication as well. So a really compelling case. And now we move to the last one in this little compilation. This one is probably my favorite of the bunch just because it's a multiple witness case. It's so poignant. I mean, these witnesses were affected so profoundly by what they saw. I call this one, The Aliens Followed Them Home. This occurred on December 19, 2015 in a rural area of Araucania, Chile. And wow, what an amazing case this is. I think the most unusual aspect is the appearance of the ETs, but how they behaved following these witnesses home, really unusual. Well, let's just get started and you'll see. This last and final case was featured on the Spanish YouTube channel, What Lives in the Shadows. And this was actually submitted to that channel by a viewer who insisted upon absolute anonymity. It was later published on the geotica.com website. The witnesses are two brothers, Miguel, age 24, a college student, and his younger brother Patricio, age 14. Miguel had recently arrived home from college so he could spend some time with his family. And he had just arrived home only recently when his little brother asked if they could take a bike ride through the paths of the forest near their rural home. Now it was a hot day, so Patricio suggested that they leave their bikes behind, hide them in the bushes, and go off into the forests to cool off in one of the many freshwater springs and creeks in this area. So they did. They hid their bikes and went hiking for a while. It started to get late, so they decided to return. And this is when they heard this strange sound behind them, kind of like rocks or stones being struck or grinded together. They turned around and they saw a sight which filled them with instant fear, because standing not far away from them were two beings, and they were huge. They estimate about 9 feet tall or more. They had very long arms, were dressed in full-body green overalls, but both boys were mostly shocked by the beings' faces. These were not normal human-looking beings. They had a very big mouth. They stared intently at them with this terrifying kind of mocking expression. Also very strange, both boys felt this intense heat coming from the beings, very strong, almost like standing next to a campfire. And in fact, the older one, Miguel, was so shocked he fell flat on his back and just sort of lay there on the forest floor, unable to move, while his younger brother, 14-year-old Patricio, stood there paralyzed and crying in fear. After just a few moments of this, with these beings staring at them, Miguel jumped up, grabbed his little brother by the arm, and they began to run as fast as they could away from these beings. They were falling and stumbling and getting all scratched up by the branches because these beings began to follow them. Miguel says he never ran so hard. He found himself filled with adrenaline as they both ran straight home as fast as they could, completely abandoning their bikes. So they made it home, and they immediately began to lock the doors and windows while their poor, concerned mother repeatedly asked them what was wrong. The younger Patricio was too frightened to even speak, and Miguel was explaining what happened when all of them heard this strange sound again coming from outside. Now Miguel and his mother very carefully and fearfully approached the window and saw these same two beings standing only about 35 feet away right outside the house, apparently communicating with each other and pointing at the house. Again, there was still that strange sound of grinding rocks going on. All of them became filled with fear. In fact, the mother knelt down to the ground and began to cry and pray. Patricio was still stricken with fear. Miguel had the presence of mind to close the curtains, go to the kitchen, and grab a knife. And for the next few hours, these beings remained outside, seeming to inspect the surroundings while these loud noises continued. Finally, their father, who worked at a lumber company, arrived in a van, and looking outside, these beings were gone. They told the father what happened. He was initially quite skeptical, but could see that something had happened. he demanded that Miguel accompany him back into the forest to retrieve the bikes they had abandoned. They couldn't find the bikes, not at first, but they did find strange marks on the ground and broken bushes and trees where the boys had seen these strange beings. Following this incident, 14-year-old Patricio began to suffer from nightmares and insomnia. He refused to sleep in the dark. He needed to have a light on. It got so bad, he ended up undergoing psychiatric treatment. The mother was still scared, so she brought in a Catholic priest to bless the house. Thankfully, there were no other encounters, but the incident did cause quite a bit of strife between Miguel and his father. This is a good example, this case, I think, of how frightening an encounter can be. People just aren't expecting to see something like that. And when they're confronted with it and it completely shatters their worldview in an instant, it can be quite traumatic. And then to have these things actually chase them home through the forest, I mean, that has to be pretty scary, especially when they remained outside their home for over an hour. So I don't blame them for, having a strong emotional reaction. It's a shame that it did cause some stress in terms of the family relationships, but this again is another pattern we see, and why it's so important to investigate these kinds of cases and get the word out that these things can happen, so people will be more prepared for the possibility of these kinds of events. But another really unusual case with very tall humanoids. Just a lot of details that are super interesting. All right, that's it for today. 10 cases from all over the world, from the 1950s up to 2015. As you can see, all different types of ETs, short little dwarf-like beings, grays, human-looking ETs, really tall beings, all different kinds of beings, but pretty much humanoid without exception, which has really important implications, and I think speaks again to the fact that we are all connected, as so many contactees have been told. We all share a common heritage. And that's what these cases, I think, really speak loudly. And I think it's one of the important takeaways, actually. But each case, again, adds to our knowledge of what's going on. Again, this is why I do this research. I find it not only endlessly fascinating, but I think there's a lot we can learn about what's out there beyond Earth. It is my assessment that these are extraterrestrials, but of course I know there are other theories. You can make up your own minds about it. Hopefully one day we will have answers. Hopefully one day this stupid cover-up will end, and we can all talk about this in a more public way that's accepted and removed from, all the disbelief, fear, confusion, and ridicule that's surrounding this subject. But until then, the research continues. So thank you guys. Thank you very much for watching. It's because of you guys I do this show. I consider you my friends. I love you all very much. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions, keep searching for the truth, and most important, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.